Please state your name followed by the pound.
Human task in Informatica Data Quality 961. You can log on to our support portal or follow us on Twitter for more details on the topic lined up for the coming months. Regarding the speaker, his name is Lax, and he has been working with Informatica for the past 3 years in global customer support. He has experience in troubleshooting different kind of issues on Informatica data quality and Power Center related products. Before we get on to the topic for today, few housekeeping tips that I would like to remind you all. Please mute your phone during the presentation. If there is too much background noise, you will be put on auto mute. We shall open up the table for Q&A at the end of the session, so kindly hold your questions till the time. Please feel free to post your questions over chat, which we can check and respond to you as well. And the session is recorded, and an email will be sent with the links to the recording after the session. You will also be able to view the video through our YouTube channel. Finally, a survey link will be sent along with the email that we send you post the presentation, and we request you all to share your feedback on the webinar and suggest topics for the future webinars as well. With this, I am handing over to Lax, who will take up today's topic.
Good morning, everyone. So in this 1-hour webinar session, I will be explaining about exception management and human task, and also how to implement the exception management with workflow and human task. The agenda for the day is we'll understand where does the exception management fits in the data quality lifecycle, designing workflow to manage the exceptions, what is the role of human task and how to configure the workflow, what is bad record and duplicate record exceptions, and how the user will review and update the exception task assigned using the Analyst tool. We'll also have a demo, and then the differences in the exception management between the 9.5x and 9.6x versions. So if you have any questions, so we'll address it at the end of the session. So before we get into the details of human task and exception management, let us understand the data quality lifecycle and see where the exception management fits into this lifecycle. Say for an example, an organization is maintaining the customer data for its business and want to understand whether the data is accurate, consistent, etc. So the first step is to profile the data, which would help to understand what the different anomalies with the data are. So the next step would be to define metrics for the quality of data. For example, the customer ID field should be 100% unique, or the name column cannot contain any blanks, and so on. The next process in the cycle is to implement the data quality rules that helps to identify and fix some of the issues identified during the profiling phase. So once the rules are implemented, it has to be monitored to see whether the data quality results are matching the expectations that were set during metric definition phase. So this is where we realize that not all the data could be cleansed automatically using the business rules that we define. So some data requires an analyst or a business user to review and correct the data discrepancies, and this is where human task plays a key role in managing some of these expectations and exceptions and fixing them. So once we review the exceptions, we continue monitoring the quality of data, and the cycle continues. Now that we have understood the importance of exception management, let us understand how we can implement this using the data quality. There are 3 stages in the exception management. First, we need to design a workflow with a human task such that an automated process will be integrated with the human to correct the exceptions manually. Second, we manage the exceptions created for the bad records to increase the data accuracy. And third, like the bad record exception, we will also manage duplicate exceptions to remove the duplicates and create a master record. So with this, let us understand the process flow of these steps. So in this process, we have a DQ system, a data steward, and a manager. So in a DQ system, a workflow consists of a mapping task and human task. So this workflow is deployed as an application to handle the exceptions. Now, when the application runs, the DQ system will move the good records to the target as they are already cleansed. Bad records are assigned to the data steward for review and corrections. So after the correction, now the data steward will submit it for the manager's review. So manager is again a user who will approve or reject the changes. If it is approved, then the approved records will be written to the cleansed data, else it will be assigned back to the data steward for the correction. So here the process of identifying the good and bad records is an automated process, and what the data steward and the manager performed is manual process. So this way the data quality facilitates the integration of people, process, and technology to achieve the quality data. Now, how is the first stage in the exception management is achieved? So we need to create a workflow where a human task is configured to notify the users about the task assigned to them. So generally, a human task is a sequence of steps, and each step represents the type of activity a user needs to perform. Say for example, in the exception step of the human task, a user will be correcting the bad records. In the cluster step is used to examine duplicate records and then create a master record out of it. Later, a review step is used to review the activities completed in the exception or the cluster step. So at this stage, the automated process and the humans are integrated. And the second one is the bad record exception. So the second stage is about managing this bad record exception. So in this stage, the user will review and correct the exceptions using the Analyst tool. So I shall show how the records are reviewed and corrected during the time of demo. So by this bad record management, there is an increase in the data accuracy. The third stage is about the duplicate exceptions management. Here, the user will consolidate the duplicate records to create a master record. So this duplicate exception will remove the duplicates. So these are the three stages that what we have seen. So let's get into the demo to understand and to know what are the steps and the configurations to configure this workflow and the human task. Okay, so let's see what are the steps to be followed from the developer tool to configure the workflow and the human task for the bad record. So there are certain steps that we need to configure for a bad record exception management. So first we'll be creating a workflow with the start and the end event, like what you see here. And we need to create a mapping that will examine the data set for the invalid or the duplicate records. So that mapping contains an exception transformation that writes a good quality records to the database table and writes the exceptions to the exception table. So we'll be adding this mapping task to the workflow, and we need to configure the same, and followed with a human task to the workflow, and then there will be a mapping next to a human task which will read the exceptions table and to write the records to the cleansed table if the human task updates the record with an approved status. So you can add the second mapping to the workflow. And also to notify the users, there is an option that we can configure to notify when the task is completed or it is assigned to the user. So let's see the first mapping which is there in the workflow. It's about to identify the exception. So we have a source that is being profiled to identify the invalid records, followed with an exception transformation that writes the good quality records to the database table, and if in case it has exceptions, and those exceptions will be returned to the target. So coming back to the workflow, you can see the mapping contains the exception transformation. So there's one important thing to be noted here is creating a variable for the exception load count. So this variable will store the number of records that contains unresolved data quality issues and requires a manual review. So the records may contain errors or they may contain duplicate information as well. So the developer tool will list a single instance of the exceptional load count that you can see here, though the mapping will have multiple exception transformation. So it will be pointed here to show a single exceptional load count. So this is where we need to assign a variable which is of an integer type. So I have named it here as xCount. So this exception load will have the workflow variable that contains a single exception. So if we're not having this information in the workflow, then there may be an unexpected behavior that we can see here. So this is the workflow followed with the mapping. So there are certain configurations that we need to perform before we adding a task to the human task. So the first thing is here the data source to let the human task know that this is the exception table where the exception records are stored. So we'll be specifying a connection and the exception table which will be a target table in the mapping. So this is the exception table that what we used in the mapping, and that mapping will be used as a data source for your human task. The second, we have a task distribution. So from here we can configure how to divide the task for the users. So is that by the number of items per task or the number of tasks that the user should get assigned. So we have something called as a notification where you can add your recipients here to whom the notification should be sent, and also there is an input that what we created for the mapping variable will be assigned to the human task. So let's open the human task. So you can see the human task is again similar to the workflow with the start and the end event. And specific to the human task, there are certain tasks that you can see here. So being a bad record exception, we are adding an exception step that you can see here. So the exception step will be followed with the review step. So basically the human task is going to do a cleansing on the bad record, and then the reviewer will review the changes what the data steward or the user performed on the exception step. And also there are certain configurations that is required for the exception step. You can see the participants. So the task performer here says a couple of users saying a data steward and the administrator. So these are the users that whom this exception task will be assigned, and these users will be working on this bad record exception. So you can also add a business administration who can monitor this. So here I have specified as a manager. So the participants are basically the users who will be working on this exception step. Followed with the timeout. So we have also a duration that what we set. It says a duration of 1 day. So what happens? So if I try to execute this human task, this exception steps will be assigned to the users, and it can be on schedule for 1 day, and on later it goes to the overdue state. So we have a notification here individually available for every single step. So you can have an exception step here, and I've created a notification for a create and wanted a data steward to know that there is an exception step created for a data steward, so that the user will now get a notification and then log into the analyst tool to work on the exception step to clear the issues. So followed with the review step. So the properties again remains the same. You can see the participants that who will be performing a reviewer. So here I made a reviewer will be a manager, and then you have a timeout similar to what we have seen in the exception step and the notification. But if you notice, there is one thing which is for the review step is the configuration. So there is a drop down. It says what is the review step that a reviewer is about to perform. So here, since we have an exception step, the drop down shows you an exception step. So since we select this, a reviewer will get a notification that there is a review available to look into the exception step. So this is, if in case of a cluster, then it will be a cluster step. So once you complete the workflow, we will be validating and deploying it as an application on the DIS to execute. So if you go to your admin console, so you can see the status of the workflow running from the monitoring tab. So you can see here the workflow which is currently executing. So there is one step that you can expand the hierarchy here to see the list of jobs that are actually running, or else also there is a graphical view that you can see a graphical representation of what the workflow and where exactly the workflow is in progress. So it shows the start task where the workflow is actually started, and the mapping, the first mapping here, and then the human task which is currently in progress. So this is the other user a view of to understand or to know on what status the workflow is actually running. So now let me log in as a data steward. So once you log in to your Analyst tool, so the start workspace will show the list of jobs or the exception tasks that have been assigned to the user. So I logged in as a data steward. So basically the exception step, as I showed, the task performer has been assigned for the data steward and the administrator. So now the data steward is logging in to see if he has received any exception step. It's getting loaded. Okay. So you could see the menus. It's getting loaded now. Okay. So once it opens the admin console, the Analyst tool, in the start workspace, you can see a My Task option, where this shows the list of exceptions that the user is being assigned. So you can see certain exception steps. So these are the exception that says it is for correcting the exception. So it is basically an invalid records what the user is having. So that exceptions will be corrected by a data steward. So there are a few options here, if you notice. Say for instance, the first one, there are certain filters here. So say if I'm searching for a certain exception with the ID, so I can use this filter options to get it filtered on the exceptions task. To open the exception, we can select this option and go to the menu and say open, or else you can click the exception directly right here to open the exceptions assigned. So now you can see the exceptions task opened. So there are certain red exclamation. When you do a mouse over, it says like an invalid status. So these records are basically invalid records which are not right. So this exceptions to be corrected so that this will be cleansed and then moved as a cleansed data. So the first view what we see in here, right, is just a view when you cannot edit anything. So in order to edit, first we need to get into editable mode. So click on the edit, So now you can see the same exceptions records that are opened here, and we could see starting with the country says US is valid, and in certain places the format is something different. So the data steward decides that this is an invalid record, so just removing the dot and making it as a format which is required. So coming out, you can see the red exclamation disappeared, and you can see a green tick which says like it's a validated record. So similarly, there are certain null, so you can click on the null places and you can key in the value. If you click outside, again the red exclamation disappears and it's validating the record. So what if we feel that you can see like there are multiple places there is null and there are certain places it's a different record. So there is an option to update all the records as in a bulk mode. So we can use a find and replace option right here. So you can click here and let us know to what to find. So I'm searching for a null with the column country. So I'm going to replace it with US. When I click on replace all, it gives the option to change this only to the current page or to all pages. So you can see all the blank values which was there earlier is filled with the values that what we keyed in, and the red exclamation disappeared and then followed with a green validation sign. So there are other options that are available for a data steward on this specific record to make it whether it's an accepted record or if the record to be rejected. Say for an instance, I'm selecting the first record. If I go to the record actions, you can see there is a menu for reprocess the record, accepting the record, rejecting the record, then marking it as reviewed. So what is accepting the record? So when I click on the accepting record, you could see there is a flag which says the record is being accepted. So once a record is set to accepted, so this record will be marked as acceptable for storage in the database. So we are basically making the record to accept without changing the data, or else once we edit the data, we'll make this flag saying like accepted. So similarly, there is an option if the data steward feels that this record should not enter the target. So in that case, a record can be selected and make it as rejected. So you can see the different signs that flags the record saying like accepted and rejected. So there is the other option for reprocess. So what is the reprocess here? So if the data steward is not clear about whether this record should enter the database or it should be rejected, so in that case this record can be flagged as reprocess so that the record will be used in the other application in terms of a different way of cleansing, and it can be accepted at the other application. So this is the use of a reprocess. So there is also an option for adding a comment so that once the data steward completes this and giving it to the reviewer, and on this specific record to make a comment, it can be made here as using this comment option. So similarly, you can see a flag for a comment. So the reviewer can click on this comment and get to see what is the comment that the data steward has given for this specific record. So there are other two options here, is mark as reviewed and clear the status. So the mark as reviewed is nothing but, since it has been reviewed, you will mark this record as reviewed so that the reviewer can skip, or again the reviewer can still further approve this reviewed state. So if in case we have made it at this place and decided that it should not be reviewed, so there is an option to clear. You can use the clear reviewer status, so the flag will disappear. And similarly, for all other notifications like accepted or rejected, we can use the clear record status so that this will be cleared from the record set. So there is an option to export the data to Excel if in case a user who doesn't have an access to the Analyst tool feels that this record can be exported in Excel and shared with the user to get the feedback, and then possibly the data steward will assign or modify this records. So let's consider the data steward has corrected all these records. So all the invalid records has been validated and corrected. So next the data steward will click on save. So on clicking on save, all these exceptions are considered for a validated record, and now you can see a task action menu open for you. So if you click on this, there is an option which says the review step. So this task action is nothing but the next action that is available in the human task. So if you remember in the human task flow, I have showed that there is an exception step followed with the review step. So now the data steward, who is an exception user, will be correcting all these records and will submit this for the review step so that the reviewer will get notified. So the data steward is submitting for a review step. So you will get a notification that this exception is submitted. So the task action for the review step has been successfully executed. So now this review step will be disappeared from the inbox of a data steward, and so it's getting refreshed. So now the same exception step will be going to the reviewer. So let me log out from a data steward. I'm logging in as a reviewer. So I made a manager who will be a reviewer. Okay, so the view of the analyst tool for these exceptions will not be different for a reviewer or the data steward. It's again start workspace will be opened for this user, which will show instead of the exception step, the reviewer will see the review steps. Getting loaded. So what is the steps that a reviewer will do? So basically a reviewer is the person that who will look into the changes what the data steward has performed in the exception step. So in the exception step, a data steward modified the country names. So that will be flagged here as an accepted or rejected. So now the reviewer can review the step. So we can see here the review step which says review the exceptions assigned for the reviewer. So similarly, you can click on the link. So now this opens the exception step. So you could see the records which were validated or corrected by the data steward is now showing to the reviewer, and also there are flags that are set for the record level. So as part of a reviewer, he can approve these changes or reject these changes. So again, to perform the same, it has to be done during the editable mode. So get into the edit view. So now the exceptions are opened in the edit. Say for an instance, I want to make this as an approved record. So as a reviewer, I have certain options what the data steward has received. So you can see a green notification here which says an approved record. It's saying like reviewed, and if the reviewer feels like it has accepted, and the reviewer can use approve record edit. So you can see the flag change the color code from blue to green, which says it is approved. So this is why the reviewer will just look into the changes what the data steward has performed, and a reviewer has a right to overwrite what the user or the data steward has performed. So in this case, say a gender which was not validated, so still there is an option for a data reviewer who can change it at this place and make sure the records are approved or accepted. So once we set the record to be accepted, so all these records will now move to the target. So similarly, there is an option to do a bulk edit. So you can use the same option. We'll find what is the options that we are looking for on which column, and we can replace it with whatever value. Then the reviewer can again set if the record can be rejected. So if we set to reject, you can see a red flag which notifies that the records are getting rejected. So once the reviewer completes the review step, again the reviewer will go for saving all the changes. So click on the task action. You can see now it is showing us end event. So which is basically the task action will show the next action available in the human task. So the human task started with a start workflow event followed with an exception step, what the data steward has performed, and submitting to the review. The reviewer has arrived to the review step. So since the review is complete, the next is to end the event. So when the data has been cleansed and the reviewer submit on end event, and the complete human task workflow is submitted to end. So you can see a notification here, end event executed successfully. So from the task list, earlier we have seen there are exception step which is available for correcting. So once it is submitted, it disappeared, saying like it has been completed and moved to the next step. So this is the step what basically a bad exception or the bad record exception management has been performed. So let's again get into a developer to see what a duplicate record exception is. So if you can see here again the workflow with the start and end event, we have a mapping followed with a human task. So similar to a bad record exception, for the duplicate record exception we have certain steps. So first we create a mapping that generates a score value for the data quality issue. So you could see here the sample mapping which is having a source and followed with a match transformation. So this match transformation is used in a cluster mode to generate the score values for a duplicate record exception. So configuring the duplicate record exception, so here we use the exception transformation, but instead of a bad record exception, we selected a duplicate record exception to read the match transformation output so that it is configured in a way the transformation to write the records to the database based on the match score values in the record. So we configure the data object for the target for an automatic consolidation. So generally this mapping will identify the duplicates and gives to the human task so that the duplicate will be handled with the analyst tool by the data steward and reviewed by the reviewer. So if you go back to the workflow, the configuration remains the same. You could see the list of options that what we specified. So again, we need to ensure that the mapping task will have the exceptional load count to be set, and as I said, it's a variable of an integer type to be set. And for the human task, the data source will be the exception target table which is used in the mapping. So the task distribution and all the steps follows. So, but a simple change here is, since it is a duplicate record exception, instead of an exception step, you could see a cluster step is being used. So the cluster step is basically to remove a duplicate exceptions. So we'll be adding a cluster step and followed with a review step. So the options again will be the same, participants and the timeout notification, and all remains the same. So once you validate this, you will be submitting it to deploy and run on the DIS. So the application will be monitored from the monitor tab. So let me log in as a data steward to show you what a duplicate exception step is all about. So in terms of an exception step, you could see it is named as an exception step or the exception to identify the bad record and to cleanse this. But for a duplicate, the naming for the exception will be a cluster step because we use a cluster task in the human task. So once the analyst loads in the start workspace, you could see the list of exceptions assigned to the specific user. So I logged in as a data steward again because he is the user that who will be working on the duplicate exceptions. So there is one important thing which is there in the cluster step is we will not see the list of records like how we see in the exception, rather it would be in terms of a cluster. So let me show you the cluster, how the cluster step is actually looked. So now the task has been opened. From the task workspace, you can see the list of exceptions that are assigned. So you can see a cluster step which is showing us on schedule. So let me click on the cluster step. So now the cluster exception is getting open. So you can see there is a little difference when compared with the exception step and the cluster step. So there are multiple tabs here. So each tab is called as a cluster here. So let's talk about what is a cluster. So here the cluster is a set of records in which each record matches at least one other record based on the match score. So you can see each cluster will have a preferred record. The preferred record is nothing but which contains the most accurate representation of the information in the cluster. So the preferred record is something which will be stored in the database. So the other records in the cluster are redundant, and by default the Analyst tool selects the first record as the preferred record. So what are the other options available in the cluster step? So you can move the record from one cluster to the other. You can create a new cluster with one record, with the record of unique and all that. So let's go to the edit mode. So now you can see the first cluster which is showing a record of a customer named John Smith. So the first record which is saying as a preferred, which is having all the values identified as a preferred. So the data steward feels that the last name there is a spell match, so that in order to select one, if you select the specific column value in the other available duplicate records, you could see the preferred records is getting updated automatically. So since the last name is changed, let me try to change the first name, the full name as well. So when I clicking on the John Smith, so you could see the preferred records are getting updated. So unlike the exception transformation, the exception step, the data steward clicked on each column and then keyed in the right value to make the record valid. But here, the cluster step, whatever the record which is made as a preferred, you can select the list of records from the available duplicates to make a one master or a valid record. So this reduces the duplicates. So similarly, once the changes are done, the data steward keeps moving to the second cluster. So like here, there is a middle name option available in the other two records. So the data steward picks this value. And again, let's go to the edit mode and then click on the middle name. You can see the preferred records is getting updated. So there are certain other options which is available for the cluster action. So if you drop down, you could see find cluster, create cluster, and making a comment and confirm. So let's see one after the other. So the first one, I would like to find a cluster. So I'm searching for a middle name. So I'm searching for a middle name. So you could see the cluster shows the option that are matching for this. So when I click on OK, so this specific record will be added to a cluster, so that can be used in the existing cluster in order to make a preferred record. So by default, if you can select the records, you can see the records are getting highlighted, and if in case we need to select the multiple records, we can hold the control key and press the multiple records to select. So let me select the first record and click on OK. So this is added as a cluster here. So you could see there's one other cluster which is added with the middle name which are matching with the V. So this is the place where we can find the cluster, and also there is an option to create a cluster. So if in case if we need a new cluster, you can see a new value. So you can, if preferred a data steward and this record is being a unique and want to make this into a different cluster, so you can use the option available, so that record will be moved to a new cluster. So you could see here the record which is moved has been created a new cluster. So every cluster which is having a preferred record is considered to be a unique, and then that record will be moved to the target as a removing the duplicates. So the other options in the cluster are, it can be marked as a confirming the cluster review. So when you mark it, it will be making it on top of the cluster. So you can see a flag which shows as the cluster has been reviewed, and the other option is to add a comment, like similarly what we have done in the exception step. And also here from the cluster step, there is an option to export this data to the Excel in the for the other users who doesn't have the exception. So let's think the data steward has performed all the changes in the cluster. So and then saving all this, so you could see a task action open now. So when we click, it says again the review step, because the workflow is ordered, the cluster step is followed with a review step. So on clicking this, again it notifies the user that this has been sent to the reviewer. So now the cluster will be disappeared from the task or the inbox of the data steward. So you don't see any cluster right here. It's all about only the exception step. So now let me log in as a manager to review what are the cluster steps that what a data steward has performed. So the reviewer basically, again, you can review, accept the changes what the data steward has performed in the cluster step, or it can be rejected. So the options from the cluster action, it remains the same, if you could see. So again, the reviewer will get into the edit mode to see all these changes, and then clicks on the record, and then from the actions, the reviewer will flag the record as accepted, or the review what has performed will be accepted. It's getting loaded. So the task queue is opened for the reviewer. So you can see there is a review step which says review the duplicates. So now the reviewer will open the review step, and now you can see the exceptions that are flagged. So if the reviewer feels that this record is been valid, so the reviewer will get into the edit mode and go to the clusters and say mark as accepted. So this again the flagging color could have been changed from a blue to green. So this confirms like the records are getting accepted by the reviewer. So this is basically a task of a reviewer, that what he can do, and again the reviewer is having an option to override the changes. So you can edit it right this place and change the options what the data steward has performed. So let's save this. So now the reviewer wants to end the event. So you can see now for the reviewer it shows end event. So on clicking this, complete process of the cluster step completed. Now it gives a notification that it has been ended the task. So these are the steps that what are involved in the exception step and also in the cluster step. So there are a few things what an administrator can perform. So I would like to show that as well. So I'm logging into the analyst as an administrator. So what an administrator is basically performed. So this exception steps will be assigned to the user, and the administrator can reassign this, or the administrator can decide whether this option or the cluster step should be exist or it can be removed from the queue. So again, the administrator will see the start workspace, which will show the list of tasks if he is also again a user who for what the exception tasks are assigned, or else there is an option to select the task administration for performing all the administration tasks. So basically the task administration will be like reassigning the exceptions or removing it from the user's queue and all that. So there is the other option called the task maintenance, where the user basically will view and open it. So meantime it opens with the analyst. Let me show you. These are the few options available. So you can see the analyst tool, which is the URL, and there are the exception in the task steps which are assigned to the users in the group. There's an option for the filter, and also which says the owner to which this specific exception has been assigned. So this is the view of a bad record exception. So you can see the list of tasks assigned, and also the menus available for the exception step. And for the duplicate, it's again a clusters. So you can see the number of clusters and also the other menu available for this. So what are the main differences between the 9.5x and the 9.6x versions? So in 9.5, the Informatica Data Director service should be configured from the domain in the admin console when you try to configure the other data quality services like model repository, data integration service, analyst. But starting from 9.6, it has been now part of the analyst service. So there is no need of creating a specific service called IDD now. So in 9.5, since there was a specific service for IDD, there was a separate URL also available for the IDD. But now since it has been integrated with the analyst URL, it can be accessed. And the properties were available in the IDD service under the human task options, but now it's all that with the analyst human task. So coming back to the administration role, you can see there is an option called My Task, and now there is another option called Task Administration. So when you click on the Task Administration, and this option is visible only if the user is having an administration access. So you could see there are certain options available here to complete link, reassign task and all that. Say for an instance, the first option is here is complete link task. So what is this complete link task is going to perform? If an administrator completes all the task instance and due to some issues or the error feels like all these exceptions should be removed, so that the workflow will be restarted again. So this option can be used. So on specifying this, it will link all the exceptions that are created during the time of the execution. When you click on OK, once it is refreshed, you could see a certain list of exceptions which are linked together will be moved from the queue. So this is basically when the administrator feels like there is an issue that the workflow has to be redeployed or restarted. We can remove all the exceptions that are already created, and then we can use this. The other option is you can see this specific exception which is saying there is a user who is already assigned as a data steward, and if administrator feels that it can be reassigned, you can use the reassign task option. So this will show the list of users. So from a data steward, if administrator decides to give this to a manager and clicking on this, so this specific exception is now getting reassigned from a data steward to a manager. The other such option is you can release the task, save, or open this task for viewing and all that. So these are a specific administration where the other users cannot have the access to this option to reassign or to make the complete view. So this is the task administration view, and if you go back to the task my task view, again it shows the list of all the tasks assigned. So one thing to be noted here, you could see like there is the owner which says empty. So when the first time if a user clicks on the exception and coming back, so that specific exception is being assigned to the user. So the administrator clicked on this exception. So now this specific exception is now being assigned to the administrator. So the administrator is the one who will be working on this exception, and if it has to be given to the other user, then the administrator will use the option of reassign or the releasing the task. So with this demo, I think we are clear about what are the steps that involved in the exception management for the bad record and the duplicate record exception, and also what is the role of a data steward and the reviewer on the exception task. And the summary, so we have seen where the exception management fits in the data quality lifecycle. So we also seen what are the configurations that we need to perform on a workflow and the human task. So we know how the bad record exceptions are being handled by the data steward and the reviewer, and similarly to the duplicate exceptions. And also we have seen the differences with 9.5x and 9.6x. So now the forum is open for the QA.
Presentation mode is now disabled.
Any questions?
Can I request others to take a call on mute? I request the participants to take the call on mute.
Is the meeting recorded, Ashwin?
Yeah, this record is being, the complete webinar is being recorded and it will be available in the YouTube.
Chat window regarding the issue tracker system integration with this workflow process.
Can you please come up with the question again? I'm sorry.
I have a question here.
Hello. It looks like people on the call doesn't have any questions, so there are a few questions from the chat.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, hello.
I have a question actually. Is there any possibility to create a new rule in the analyst or admin forum? You have some couple of exceptions to be written as a rule through the designer, right? So is there any possibility at runtime that if analyst just to create a new rule on the fly, is it possible to do that?
No, Analyst is basically a tool here which will just to show you the exception, and the user will be having an access to work on those exceptions. So during the mapping phase, the developer has to design the exception transformation such a way to handle these exceptions.
So the analyst basically, or say manager basically cannot create a rule on the fly using the tool that which you have shown us shortly, right?
No, there is no option.
Okay. And how different is this from MDM? Actually, you can even do the same with fuzzy logic and having some tools with them, right? Hello.
So I think it's about an MDM. So this is actually not the MDM. It's completely different from the MDM.
Sorry, your voice is not audible. Can you?
Can be considered as one piece of an MDM solution because we are trying to retrieve some master record using the deduplication. It cannot be considered as a whole MDM solution.
Please come again. I just lost track of what you said.
Probably you can drop an email with a question and we can respond to you.
Sure.
Okay.
Hi, this
a few questions in the chat. Yes.
Hi, this is Hari. I have a question. Can I raise it now or should I wait?
Yeah, Hari, please go ahead.
Yeah. You have shown the workflow, which is I mean, bringing a data set from the source based on the criteria and pushing it as a human task. This workflow is running on the source, and once the task is done, the target gets updated. Is this a case where source and target are actually the same data sets, or they can be different?
No. It is basically both source and target are not the same. We have a source from which we are identifying the invalid records, and then we have a specific target which is for a good record table, and after the cleansing or removing the duplicates, this record will be moved to a new table which is basically having only the good records. Yeah. So we are not rewriting.
Yeah, so for an example,
we will not be rewriting the source.
Yeah, okay, great. So for an example, if you have identified 100 errors and that generated a task, and whoever is the data steward and manager reviewed 50 of those records and confirmed, and then when he completes the task, those 50 records will get landed into a target, or there will be 100 records landed into a target?
No, it will be only 50 records.
Okay. Now the third question is, when you will rerun the workflow, will that skip those 50 records which are landed into a target, or that will still rerun those which are approved and landed in a target?
Okay. See, there is an option called the status field that we'll set for the records as approved or accepted. Okay? So in this case, when a reviewer will flag those records as approved, in that case, that record will be moved to a target as a good record. Okay. And if in case it is not used, it can be processed for the other application. In case of it is to the resource.
So how it is getting moved to the correct table, means the record you have marked it as a accepted one. So how it is getting moved to the clean table?
So if you remember in the workflow, we had a first mapping to identify the exception, followed with the human task, and there is a second mapping. So the second mapping will have the exception table as the source table. So that source table, the records will be picked, and we are using a filter here to identify the status field which are set to approve, and those records will be picked and then moved to a target which is a good record basically. I think you have the steps available in the documentation.
Okay.
Okay. So we are maintaining, means we are reading the data at the source, whole data every time we are reading it from source.
Yeah, the first time to identify, yes, it is the complete source, but once we work on the exceptions, then the exception table which is created will be the source in your second mapping.
Perfect.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Actually, I do have a follow-up question that you told me. So what happens, see, ideally, your source is not going to get every time a new set of records, right? Let's say I have a CRM table that has 1,000 records. You process it the first time, you have done 500 records went to good table, 500 went to exceptions table. Next time I run this workflow, it's the older records that you need to rerun again.
I think there was a break in between actually.
So my question is, how do you actually ensure that the source that you actually processed already is not basically reprocessed again?
So for this, the question is, what if the records are not, when we're rerunning the workflow, if all the records are getting reprocessed again. So basically the mapping logic should be framed in such a way that we are not picking all the records every time.
So how do you figure that out is my question.
Well, basically we have one exception table, right, that is different from the source. So if you have processed first 500 rows and that will have some status field updated for those 500 rows as like approved, accepted, rejected or reprocessed or anything. So if you have any remaining 500 rows not processed, then you have to basically start from reading your source what is there in the exception table with the status field that is not marked as approved. Okay, and that should be considered, and then again it needs to be loaded as a fresh exceptions to the exception table and then proceed further.
No, but let's say if we have, let's say if I have 1,000 duplicate records, right, of the 10,000 table, and a new set of 1,000 records come in. It's a duplicate record. How are you going to figure out that comparing with the exceptions table that these new 1,000 records is the one that you need to process?
Well, we are not doing here a CDC kind of thing where the mapping can intelligently detect the new 1,000 records. So all the things that we would be, the data stewards or the managers will be working on only the data set which is available in the exception table.
No, but if you run again, you're going to get the same set of exceptions all over again and again, right?
Yeah, if you read that again and again, yes, you get the same. That is the reason you need to make use of the status field column in the exception table before you run the mapping which reads the source again, so that it filters the records accordingly.
Alright, I think we are running short of time here, and I think if there are any more questions, some of the questions that are in the chat window, we have a track of those questions and we will be responding to you back over email for those questions, and we will also follow this with an email with the survey link and the YouTube recording link as well. So you can always respond to that email with your questions, or you can also post your questions or comments on Informatica portal, or you can comment on the YouTube video. I would like to thank you all for taking this time to participate in this eventful session on human task and exception management, and thanks everybody, and we are ending the session at this point in time. Please share your feedback and do your survey.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thanks, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.